Well, anyway, I'm delighted now that the Conservative MP for Wokingham, Sir John Redwood, is with me to discuss something different, which apparently is going to be in a new bill, an energy bill that's put before Parliament in the next couple of weeks to do with energy efficiency rules. Sir John, a very good morning. Thanks for joining me on Tice Talk. I'm sure you are energised after the summer break and looking forward to roaring back into the House of Commons to try and get some common sense back into our country. But
yes, on both counts. That would be good, wouldn't it, to get some common sense there?
There are rumours that there's a new energy bill coming before Parliament, and it's suggesting that property owners who don't comply with energy rules on energy, on reducing the consumption from a particular property, could face serious fines of up to tens of thousands of pounds, probably £15,000, or possibly even, for heaven's sake, go to prison if you're not complying with energy performance certificates.
Yes, so I read, and I and others will be trying to tease out of the government whether the bill does actually allow that, and if so, we will be very strongly against it. It is a very long and complex bill, and that isn't the only feature of it that I and quite a number of MPs are concerned about. It's a bill which is going to sign us up to massively expensive interventions in carbon capture and storage and in hydrogen, and all those need to be properly exposed and debated. I don't think Britain can afford to go alone on these issues if competitor nations are not doing the same thing, because as we're discovering with some of these net zero proposals, you don't end up with less world CO2, you end up with more world CO2, but you close things down in Britain, which is a very bad idea.
It's an absolutely terrible idea, and voters are beginning to, I think, wake up to it and actually speak out against it. For example, in the recent Uxbridge by-election, I mean, the whole ULEZ thing is it's a sort of subset of the net zero, the whole net zero agenda. But I mean, this energy bill, if it's as you infer there, it's a huge deal and a massive risk to all of us, particularly as a lot of the things seem to be able to be imposed under what they call these statutory instruments, which essentially is a sort of rubber stamping exercise.
Well, indeed. This is often a complaint about modern legislation under Labour and Conservatives, that ministers take very big general powers in the law they pass in Parliament and reassure us that, of course, these aren't going to be used in a hostile way. But it allows then the government to just put through something called a statutory instrument, a mini law, without the same scrutiny, row or debate, and that can flesh out these general powers and you end up with things that you don't want. So that is exactly why when you debate the main law with all its procedures, committee stages and main debates on the floor of the House, we need to make sure there are enough MPs raising the good questions you're raising this morning, because I and some of my colleagues on the Conservative side certainly don't think we should be sending people to prison because they didn't put enough draft insulation in. We think that's just over the top.
Absolutely right. Well, of course, there's a new Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero, Claire Coutinho, which for many people will be a new name. I think she was elected in 2019. So she's obviously got a huge remit. And I guess this new bill will fall under her department. Her views on net zero, I think, are mixed, it would seem to me. And I saw, for example, that she wanted September, in some cases, to be called Green Tember. But equally, there's stories out in the papers today that they might be looking to push forward with airport expansion, which goes against the Climate Change Committee's preferences. What's your understanding of where the new Secretary of State for Energy, where her views will be, and whether or not she's going to be rather more pragmatic about accepting that actually we've got to grow the economy and not impose unnecessary costs through net zero?
Well, she comes to this from a very different background, so I don't think she has a set of formed views on these issues, which is probably a good thing. And I do think the Prime Minister is on the move. He's been making some noises recently implying that he thinks any policies resulting from a net zero pledge for 2050 have to be sensibly paced, sensibly priced, and not leave Britain at a huge disadvantage as a result of them all. So that is progress. So I and others are busily sending emails and advice to the new Secretary of State, and we look forward to the impending debate on the energy bill as an early parliamentary opportunity to show to her that a number of us have thought this all through, and that we are extremely alarmed by the very high costs being imposed on British business, the very high taxes being imposed on British energy, and above all, by the way we seem to be offshoring so many things, importing energy and importing energy-intensive products because we've taxed ourselves out of those businesses. That doesn't save world CO2, it actually increases world CO2. But it's very bad for jobs and revenues here.
And so there's a report in today's Mail on Sunday with regard to oil and gas. In the first 6 months of this year, I think it's our lowest ever production of oil at just over 17 million tonnes, below 2022. 20 years ago, that figure of 17 would have been a figure of 50 million tonnes. And that essentially the industry, oil and gas represents about 75% of our energy needs, and yet with the windfall tax, the lack of concession or grants of new licences, businesses are just going elsewhere from that industry, and so jobs are being lost, and we're importing it, as you say, from overseas, which creates more CO2.
Yes, and indeed, if you look at gas, the CO2 position is even worse than that, because we import gas to a great extent in a liquefied form, so you have all the energy to turn it into liquid, then the energy to convert it back again, as well as the long haul in a LNG tanker. So it ends up at 2 or 3 times as much CO2 as using gas down a pipe from the North Sea. I and a few others have been campaigning about this. The Prime Minister is now fully on board. He's made a speech recently saying, of course, it makes sense to get our own oil and gas out where we have to use oil and gas, and it will produce a lot more revenue for our Treasury. But so far, there hasn't been the follow-up action. And I want to stress to the government again, it's all very well saying you're going to have another round of exploration licenses, fine. No problem with that, but it will be many years before they find oil and gas and are then allowed to exploit it. There are actually fields out there at the moment that have been discovered. They've had their exploration licenses, but they're not in production. So please, government, get the tax system right and issue the production licenses, because those new fields need to come on stream as soon as possible so that we collect the tax revenue here instead of paying all the tax to America.
Absolutely right. My concern is this new energy bill and the sort of machinations of civil servants in the new Secretary of State's department may actually sort of make it harder to actually truly encourage those new licences being granted. And as you say, fields being developed. We've got to ease the regulations to encourage it, not reduce the investment with these windfall taxes.
Well, that is the danger, and let's hope she is a good leader of her department. I think she will have been given directions from the Prime Minister in line with what we've read of his views to say that we don't want to do down our own industry, and it is a priority now that where we've got oil and gas and we need to use it, we should use our own rather than import it. It makes obvious sense on every basis. So I and others will be saying to her, these are some of the things you might like to do so that your department actually follows that policy, because it hasn't been following that policy up to date.
Absolutely right. Just finally, before I let you go, Sir John, there's sort of suggestions in some of the papers over the weekend that the Prime Minister might be looking at an election next May, as opposed to what I think was the standing assumption of next autumn, sort of October, November time. Do you think there's any truth to that, and what would be your preference?
I think it would be better for the Conservatives to have at least another year to show that they can produce the economic recovery we all want, and that inflation is well under control by then, as it should be. So I wouldn't myself recommend a spring election, but it will be up to the Prime Minister, and I dare say we'll have all sorts of rumours and reported stories on this. I will concentrate on how we can actually improve the position for my constituents and others, because I think there are plenty of things that could be done that would give us more growth, less inflation, and a better set of outcomes. And we've been talking about an important one today.
Absolutely right. Sir John, thank you so much indeed for your thoughts on that. Reducing taxes, creating more growth, creating more investment from businesses is what we need. That's how you get an economy moving. That's how you get higher wages. Thank you, Sir John Redwood, Conservative MP for Wokingham.